Hi, everybody. A warm welcome to all of you. My name is Dorothea von Moltke. I'm one of the owners at Labyrinth Books here in Princeton. And I'm so pleased that tonight we have Jonathan Haslam and joining us actually from England, where he's 5 hours ahead, and David Foglesong with us. They're here to discuss Jonathan's brand new book. It's actually, we're just ahead of the pub date, but I have it here, and I'll show it to you right here. The Spectre of War, International Communism and the Origins of World War II. This is a book of incredible deep archival research. It's a real feat also of erudite scholarship. Haslam counters what he describes as the widespread silence about the crucial role of communism, that communism and the perceived threat of communism played in the origins of World War II. He explores those fears and how they influenced conservative and ruling classes throughout Europe, and also elaborates the central importance of those fears and threats in the emergence of fascism. But before our guests discuss all of this and delve into it in great detail, I hope, I just have a couple of brief preliminaries and then I will step aside. Most importantly, I want to thank the Institute for Advanced Study for co-sponsoring tonight and helping to get word out. And then quickly, I want to point out two important buttons on your screen. The first is the Ask a Question button, if you can just find that at the bottom of your screen. The chat will come down during the conversation, but I want to encourage you all to put your questions in the queue as they come to you by clicking on that button and just typing them in there. Right above is a long kind of green button. Use that to order a copy of the Spectre of War from Labyrinth. You'll get 10% off your entire order if you enter Haslam at checkout. And you can choose to have it mailed to you or to pick it up curbside. But now on to our speakers. Jonathan Haslam, who is professor in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study, is a leading scholar on the history of thought and international relations, and in particular of the history of the Soviet Union. Both those dimensions, as well as his characteristic, careful, critical attention to ideology, are on full display in his new book. His previous influential books include Near and Distant Neighbors, A New History of Soviet Intelligence, and Russia's Cold War, from the October Revolution to the Fall of the Wall. I'll also just point out to you that he has a blog, and you can find that at throughrussianeyes.com. And that blog highlights aspects of Russia's foreign and defense policies that don't see the light of day in mainstream media. So you might want to check that out too. He is joined by fellow historian of Russia, David Foglesong, who joined us from Rutgers University, where he is professor of history. David is the author of two books, The American Mission in the Evil Empire, The Crusade for a Free Russia Since 1881, and America's Secret War Against Bolshevism, U.S. Intervention in the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1920. In collaboration with colleagues from Russia, they are I. Kurila and V.I. Zuravleva, he is now currently completing a work called America and Russia, From Distant Friends to Intimate Enemies. And his new research project after that focuses on how American and Soviet citizen diplomats contributed to the overcoming of enmity between the two nations in the 1980s. So if you are interested in Russia and the Soviet Union in the 20th century, you will really be hard-pressed to find two more learned scholars. So it really is a pleasure to be able to bring them up on the screen now, which I'm going to do with a click of a couple buttons. First, here is Jonathan. Hi and welcome, Jonathan.
Hello. Good evening.
And yes, very much evening where you are. And David, hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Let me turn things over to you.
Okay, I'm
honored to participate in this conversation with such a distinguished colleague about a really splendid book. Jonathan, I really enjoyed reading this massive work. Many years ago, near the beginning of your career, you wrote 3 volumes on Soviet foreign policy in the 1930s. Around 3/4 of your new book, The Spectre of War, is on the same period. What prompted you to go back to the interwar era and write this book?
Well, several things, but perhaps the most important was the fact that since I was writing in the 80s, the 1980s, the Russians have opened up a vast amount of archives. And in fact, the most recent archive openings occurred in the last 2 years, so right towards the end of my research. And the most important of these archives was the archives of the Communist International, which showed Russia's relations with foreign communist parties. And the added factor was that all these, well, most of the other archives are open. So Swedish archives, for example, which were closed in those days. Some British archives were open nominally, but certain things were missing. The French archives weren't actually open at that stage past 1932. So I'm very much source-driven in my search, but the questions remain the same. The answers are different because the research yielded a very different perspective.
Mm-hmm. Your research not only with the Russian archives, but also with French, Spanish. I was astonished by this. German, Polish. It's really extraordinary. A lot of scholars talk about the need for multilingual, multi-archival research, but very few have the language abilities to actually carry it out as you have. What would be one or two of the most surprising findings that you encountered in this extensive research that you've done for this book?
Yeah, well, the strange thing was that in studying international relations, you find out more about your own country through the eyes of people in other countries. So the perspectives onto Britain from continental Europe were in some ways an eye-opener. And then in Russian archives, to find material that weren't in our archives because they relate to the Secret Service, which is classified here, and then to find a copy in the Russian archives, so that one's whole worldview shifts. And I think you mentioned the Spanish material. Well, that the material on the Civil War, which we now have in Spanish documentation as well as documentation from Comintern, shows how much things were driven on the ground, events on the ground, which pushed policy. And then to find the Russians just being sucked into Spain in 1936 with the Civil War, but at the same time, the British standing back in absolute horror. And I looked at some of the letters from the Duke of Alba, who became Franco's ambassador in London, and the people he met and what they said to him. And as I suspected, from his letters, I could compile a list of all the pro-fascist elements around the British government, including Stanley Baldwin, including, to some extent, the King. George VI was sympathetic to fascism in Spain. It was quite an eye-opener. I think that was just one example of the multi-archival approach, yielding information about one's own side as well as the other sides in the equation.
Yeah, that positive British sympathy with Franco and fascism was one of the most striking things to me reading in the book. You mentioned the Comintern archive, and that brings me back to the time when we first met back in the 1980s when I was a graduate student at the University of California at Berkeley, and I think you had a visiting position at Stanford. It's a visiting fellowship, perhaps, at Stanford University across the bay. And I invited you to come up and give a talk at Berkeley about Stalin and Soviet foreign policy. And one of the things that I remember being most struck by was your comment that Stalin derided the Communist International as a lavachka, as a like a little shop where people would gather to chatter or gossip. What has the new archival material led you to see in a different way about Stalin's attitudes or relations with the Comintern, if anything, since that time?
Yeah, Stalin was a very practical sort of person, so that even if he despised something, if it was useful, he would use it. And what surprised me in relation to Comintern was that this was an organization in Moscow, really the headquarters of world revolution. Stalin didn't view that revolution as likely to come about through Comintern. So my comment about it being a lavachka was basically he shunted it aside and gave it to others to deal with. And since he was the man in charge of the entire country as we come through the 1930s, by shunting it aside for lesser people to deal with, the difficult decisions usually got delayed past the time they needed to be taken. So there's a lot of explanation in the way Comintern behaved that is a function of neglect, really.
Uh-huh. Continuing on ideology and Comintern, I want to ask you about your views of continuities and discontinuities between Lenin and Stalin. You write that Stalin was more cautious than Lenin, but you emphasize that he pursued the same revolutionary objectives. Other scholars, for example, Alfred Reber, have seen more distance developing between Stalin and Lenin, to the point that Reber argues that by the start of the Second World War, Stalin was almost repudiating Lenin and arguing we must not copy the positions of the Bolsheviks during the First World War. Would you like to address that perspective?
Yes, it was probably, I mean, it sounds heartless, but it was probably to Lenin's advantage to have died early on. He was incapacitated from 1922, and he died at the beginning of 1924. So the most difficult decision, he had to make a lot of difficult decisions when they took power in Russia in 1917, but the most difficult decisions lay ahead. And so one can only speculate that somehow his decisions would have been more humane than Stalin's. But if you look closely at the decisions Lenin did take in the early 20s, he was, 100% ruthless in pursuit of the ideal, in pursuit of the utopia of the world going communist along with Russia, and Russia creating its own socialism. The difference between them was in motivation, I think, in that Stalin paid much more attention to his own security and safety and his own supremacy than Lenin had to. Lenin brought the Bolshevik Revolution about. He was the one who decided everything. So people felt they couldn't cope without him. Whereas Stalin was, if you like, a latecomer, and he didn't have any of Lenin's virtues. And so he was always uncertain in power. And unfortunately, when Stalin got uncertain, he had people shot. So that there was for him, ideology was secondary in a sense to his personal absolute power. But at the same time, he did believe in these things. But these things, like world revolutionary world revolution were not his primary interest. They were, as it were, secondary interest. And one has to remember that even though Russia was really a lethal totalitarian dictatorship in his time, he still had to listen to voices from within the Communist Party. The Communist Party carried with it the heritage of the revolution. And however many people he shot, there were still many more in their place who believed in all this. So even if he was more of a skeptic than Lenin, and particularly than Trotsky, nonetheless, the revolution carried him forward. And what I learned from this was, it's not all about one man making one decision. It's one man coping with a lot going on, where his decisions somehow never get to be final. A lot of Stalin's, how shall I say, psychotic behavior can be explained by sheer frustration at running a country like Russia. Russia isn't Germany. And the British under Lloyd George always hoped the revolution would never get to Germany because the Germans were too efficient. As long as it stayed with Russia, there was some hope.
Well, you mentioned Trotsky. So shifting from Lenin to Trotsky, you argue that liberal officials in Britain badly misunderstood and exaggerated the difference between Stalin and Trotsky. You write that the only real difference between them in international relations was that Trotsky believed foreigners were capable of making revolutions, their own revolutions, while Stalin was very much a disbeliever in the capacity of foreigners to carry out their own revolutions without direct military assistance from the Soviet Union. I wonder whether you could address the devil's argument that that might underplay how much Trotsky was prepared to take risks to promote revolutions, and how Stalin focused more on the defense of Soviet national interests. In other words, some might argue that Trotsky focused on how Russia could be of service to world revolution, where Stalin focused more on how world revolution could be of service to Russia.
Yes, there's a lot of truth in that dichotomy. But remember, once again, as with Lenin, Trotsky was out of power effectively from 1927, really. By the end of 27, he was done with in Russia, and the rest left. And then he was, as you know, ice-picked by Stalin's agents just after the Second World War began. So it's you can then take that and say, well, what would Trotsky have done if? But what I found was striking was that when Stalin was still in charge in 1939 and invaded Poland from the other end, and then following a series of events absorbed the Baltic states into the Soviet Union in 1940, Trotsky was very impressed with it and thought, well, this is sort of the way to go. Stalin's attitude was, well, if you can have it, you might as well take it. Trotsky's attitude was, well, this is a different way of spreading the revolution. This is what Napoleon did, because Napoleon notoriously was a right-winger in French revolutionary circles.
Mm-hmm. I think your video is frozen. Jonathan, I think when you were cut off, you were talking about Trotsky's enthusiasm about Stalin's export of revolution in the neighboring areas of Baltic states and eastern Poland.
Yeah. And it's Trotsky took the view that your intentions don't matter. It's the results on the ground. And so Napoleon spread republicanism across Europe, and Stalin was going to spread communism. And then, of course, Stalin disposes of Trotsky, and but then at the end of World War II, he continues the same policy. So the fact his motivation, as you would say, is domestic centered. It's how, what can the world do for Russia? In the process, he's doing the same thing that Trotsky would have done. In other words, you see the same thing in the post-war period. The Russian attitude is, we don't trust these people who want to make revolutions themselves, like Fidel Castro. It's got to be done properly, and we're the only ones who can do it, but we don't feel like doing it at the moment.
Right. I want to come to the title of your book, which is The Spectre of War. But as you point out in the introduction, it's the Spectre of Revolution that is at least as important to the story that you're telling. Now, a specter, to me, is something imaginary, like a ghost. And yet, at moments in your book, the specter appears quite real. For example, you argue that it is the lingering menace of revolution from Bolshevism that largely explains why Britain rejects cooperation with the Soviet Union to deter German aggression. And at another moment, you write that the British Foreign Office in the mid-1930s realized that Soviet foreign policy was at root dictated by revolutionary priorities. Yet on the other hand, you also show, and here I think you're taking advantage in the Spanish case, especially of the new archival materials. You show that in France with the Popular Front, in Spain with the Spanish Civil War, in China with the conflict between nationalists and communists, in each of those cases, the Soviet authorities repeatedly sought to restrain revolutionary forces and to promote broad cooperation between communists and non-communist groups. So that leaves me with the question, if British officials exaggerated Soviet subversive ambitions in the mid to late 1930s, to what extent was that a result of the weakness of British intelligence, something that you've written about, and to what extent was it a result of preconceptions or nightmares from the past?
Yes, it's I mean the title won't describe every detail. It's a very broad brush impression. My general feeling is that the fixation on revolution was very much from the 1920s, from what Britain had suffered at the hands of Comintern in China. I mean, the Russians did everything to get the British out of China. And for the British, China was the second most important colony, even though it wasn't formally a colony. It was an enormous source of wealth for Britain. And the Russians, through Comintern, did their best to get Britain out. And they failed in the end because the British managed to be a little more flexible in the handling of the Chinese than they had been for a century. So this, if you like, it was a trauma in a way for the British because they regarded themselves as top dog. The trauma of the 20s at the hands of communism made them all too easily hyper alert to the dangers of communism in Europe from the mid-30s. Now, had France in 1936 not started to drift far to the left, and had Spain not done the same, then the British would have taken a cooler attitude. But you can see in the dispatches from the British embassies in Europe that they exaggerated what was going on, and they always exaggerated the degree to which the Russians were in control of everything. So that was their specter. It was somehow the Russians were master manipulators, in a way very naive, because the Russians saw themselves with their back against the wall most of the time. It's this attribution of purpose and agency which the British had. So yes, some of these specters turned out to be real. some, if you like, the spectral element was the exaggeration of the real. And the important thing was that the British were woefully ill-informed. MI6 actually wasn't doing its job as well as it had hoped. And government, as always with secret intelligence, usually only believes what they want to believe. So the combination of paucity of intelligence and then governments believing what they want to believe adds up to the same thing, which is basically getting things wrong day to day.
One of my colleagues at Rutgers has also written a book recently with Spectre in the title. Paul Hannebrink published a book in 2018 called A Spectre Haunting Europe, The Myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. And in that book, he highlights, well, he deals with all European nations, but and to some extent the United States. But one of the things he highlights is British conservatives' suspicion, their association of Bolshevism with Jewish subversion, disloyalty, and conspiracy. In your book, we get some glimpses of really ugly, disgraceful anti-Semitism. But overall, it seems that the association of British anti-communism is more with class than with race or ethnicity. At one point, for example, you quote Harold Nicholson's acute diagnosis that people in the governing classes think only of their own fortunes, which means hatred of the Reds. Would you like to talk about the influence of class and race in the outlooks of British leaders?
Yeah, Britain was always easier for Jews than continental Europe, because in a sense, after the adjustments in the medieval period with the English Revolution under Cromwell, the Jews were assimilated. There was no attempt to confine them to one part of the country or have them burnt at the stake if they didn't become Christians. They were tolerated. So you had a high degree of assimilation. And remember that the city of London, which became, as it were, the center point of wealth creation, and remains so, was full of people from other countries. Holland, they were Huguenot, Holland, there were Jews, they assimilated. So there wasn't this question. It was only the Morning Post, which was the most right-wing newspaper in Britain, that kept going on about Jewish Bolsheviks. Where the contrast is in Austria and in Germany, where due to the persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe, and the Russian Empire in particular, and in places like Romania, floods of Jews would come into Central Europe. So there was a sort of never-ending flow. And then some of those Jews did very, very well, but even that became a source of threat in many people's eyes. So the Jew was, I think in Central Europe, became a sort of pathological problem. Either the poor Jew is going to take your job or whatever, or weaken Christianity, and then the rich Jew is going to buy you out and throw you out of work. In other words, whatever type of Jew you were, you basically weren't very welcome. So I think it's wrong to assume that Britain was the same thing. But of course, people like Neville Chamberlain and others, it didn't take much to get them to make.
I think you froze again.
I don't know if you can hear us, Jonathan, so I'm really sorry. But I'm going to put that in the chat again. And we're going to just do, now that we have learned what we have to do, I'm going to remove Jonathan and tell him to please come back in. Jonathan, can you rejoin? And let's see if we can get him back that way. That is most likely an instability
Right. Internet connection.
on the internet and where he is. So let's try what we did before. I just invited him and he's accepting. Okay, we're getting good at this. Very good. Sorry.
Yeah, no echo this time.
Yeah, carry on, and maybe in 5 minutes or 10 minutes we can move to questions. There are some nice questions in the queue. Okay, carry on.
You were cut off when you were finishing your comments about class and race.
Oh yes, I'm sorry, I never got to class, but I mean, Britain even today is still highly class conscious, and I mean the last two prime ministers are from Eton, for goodness sake, the most expensive school that anybody's ever heard of, I presume, outside the United States. So class is critical to understanding Britain, and the Germans understood it in this sense. For them, class was everything. So class consciousness was not something peculiar to the working class. It was fundamental to those ruling the country.
That leads into my next question. One of the pleasures of reading your book is that you present vivid portraits of the leading figures. And I was particularly struck by your depiction of Neville Chamberlain. I've read a number of books that have discussed Chamberlain, and I've often seen him depicted as naive, sometimes suffering failure of nerve or cowardice. Your depiction is quite different. I wasn't surprised to read that Chamberlain and his closest advisors sought to turn Nazi Germany to the east. But I was struck by some other aspects of your depiction of Chamberlain, including how persistently delusional he was, not only up to the time of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, but even into the Second World War, after the outbreak of the war. And I wondered if you would like to address your general view of Chamberlain, and particularly, why is he so deluded?
That's a difficult question. I'm not a psychiatrist, but the thing about Chamberlain is people think that Chamberlain was associated with a peace policy. He wanted appeasement. And somehow in the mind, he must be nice. I mean, he must be one of these people who would, you know, go into his pocket to give money to beggars on the street and treat people kindly. But he wasn't. His belief was an enormous self-belief. He was a terrific leader. I mean, he led them all in the wrong direction. But from very early on, he was seen as the likely next prime minister after Baldwin, because he could get people to do what other people wouldn't do under normal circumstances. And he was seen, in a sense, as a man in a time of trouble. You needed somebody to lead you out of the mess. And unfortunately, the leaders of the Tory party thought he would lead them out of the mess, but he didn't. He led them ever further in. His problem was delusional. His problem was total ignorance. I mean, the problem with those leading the Tory party in Britain at that time, and the leftovers from the Liberal Party, were they knew nothing about foreign affairs. You know, they didn't have languages. You know, World War I was a bothersome intrusion. You know, let's forget about it. Let's get on with life. You know, the real places are places like India and China, and, you know, where you send the third son in the family who can't get into the army or the church. You send them into the empire, make some money for us. They really were a very narrow-minded set of people. And the Duke of Alba, who was really top-level aristocracy from Spain and close with the British royal family, he saw through them right away. He'd been at school in England, both at college in Windsor towards the end of the 19th century, and he saw England in those days as this amazing place run by these great aristocrats like Lord Salisbury. And then when he comes back in the 30s, he finds them run by, grubby middle-class men whose I think someone would say their extent of their vision was out of a shop window rather than anything else. Mm-hmm. So there was there was a paucity of high-quality people in public life in that period. I think that's what one would say, and a lot of them got shot to pieces in the trenches in World War I. Mm-hmm.
Well, the last question I had in mind stems from my own focus on the United States. I'm really more a historian of U.S. foreign relations than I am of Russia. In your book, Americans appear as observers of developments in Europe and East Asia, but not really as players or actors in the story. That led me to think about how important was the United States to Stalin in this period, 1933, when the United States recognized the Soviet Union, to the outbreak of the war, 1939, 1940. In what ways did the United States figure for Stalin in his perspective?
Yeah, the United States, as seen from Moscow after 1933, when diplomatic relations were established between Moscow and Washington, the view of the United States was rather like the United States view of Brazil from 1945. It's going to be the next superpower. When is it going to happen? And it never happens. A very big place with lots of, enterprising immigrants in it, but somehow they never get their act together. I mean, the point about the United States was that its entire monetary and economic policy was a walking disaster area from the 1920s. It's going to sound very familiar to what we're about to go through. From the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, easy money became very easy money. And unfortunately, in the 1920s, everybody and everybody's relative was borrowing money to buy stocks and shares in the hope that the thing would never explode. And we had 1929, the Great Depression. So what the United States would have been with a sensible monetary and fiscal policy is a very different thing from what it was. It was crippled by the Great Depression. And prior to that, it was in a way crippled by political division, because the men who wanted to build the League of Nations and create a liberal Wilsonian world lost. And partly because Wilson overdid it and then fell terribly ill. So the United States were never able to play the role that the Russians, in a way, Stalin, hoped they would be able to play. And then when they did start playing a role, it was the wrong one. In 1945, the United States got its boots on and really started exercising its muscles.
Well, thank you, both of you. Thank you also for being so unflustered across our little tech mishaps, which I do think served a purpose, because during the first one is when everyone thought of their questions, and we have quite a few in the queue. So maybe I just go ahead and dive into that. Beginning with a question that just connects with your conversation about Neville Chamberlain. And the question here coming from a Vice Admiral, Sir Alan Hoffman, and then it gets cut off. The question is, did the Neville Chamberlain conservative government continue the Spanish pro-fascist, pro-Franco policies of the Stanley Baldwin conservative government? And what cabinet members were most outspoken in this viewpoint? He thanks you also for your brilliant research and work in fascism and communism.
Well, that's very kind. The only person within the government from the time of the Spanish Civil War, well, there were two people, Duff Cooper, who was very pro-French and therefore very anti-German, and therefore would not take a pro-fascist position on Spain. He didn't really have a position. And the other person was Anthony Eden, who was really in the wrong political party. Eden was really, by nature, a Lloyd George liberal. He just ended up in the Tory party. And Eden was the only one, I think it was in cabinet somewhere, he said in cabinet at one point, we wouldn't want these, referring to the fascists, to win out, would we? And everybody sort of turned around and thought, Anthony, more or less, what planet are you on? Of course we don't want the communists to win, and it's a choice between the two. So it was really, fascism for them was just will-o'-the-wisps and lunatic people in big boots and strange uniforms. But, you know, they're in their heart of hearts, they were true patriots, and, you know, they obviously did some grubby things. But on the other hand, they weren't communists. And anyway, if you got rid of them, communists would take their place. So it was a question of the, you know, what was going to be less damaging. But there was this sort of inner prejudice. And remember that Winston Churchill did call Stanley Baldwin, when he was Prime Minister in the mid-20s, Britain's Mussolini. And he wasn't meaning to be rude.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm going to ask you a next question that I have a personal interest in, having gone to school in Germany in the early 80s. The question here is, it seems you're saying communism has been inadequately recognized as the cause of World War II, but didn't the Historikerstreit, so the dispute among historians that was centered around the conservative historian Ernst Nolte, didn't the Historikerstreit in the late 80s do just that, attempt to explain the rise and violence of National Socialism and European fascism as a response to the threat of communist revolution? And I say I have a personal interest because that is what we were taught in school in Germany.
Yes, this is a complicated issue. How much time have you got? Both communism and fascism came out of the same moral crisis that in a way helped cause World War I and was accentuated by it. I mean, the intellectuals of pre-World War I, from 1900 to 1914, were going through a sort of curious malaise. They started cults of violence. They believed that in a sort of violent utopian world somehow. And fascism had its roots in that period too. And the common point between the two was Georges Sorel, the anarcho-syndicalist, and he felt that both the Bolshevik Revolution and Mussolini's fascism were the right thing. In other words, that they were in a way twins. So in other words, both of them grow out of the same malaise in Europe. And certainly in Hitler's case, and in Mussolini's, the emergence of Bolshevism was what prompted them into action. I mean, Mussolini was always active, but the question was in which direction. Mussolini became active on the right as a response to the threat of Bolshevism, the Red Years after World War I in Italy. And Hitler responded the same way. And all of the values they believed in the state. They believed in the nation state. They worshipped the nation state. It was an organic thing. And Bolshevism was a sort of cancer cancer growth on it, because the Bolsheviks they didn't believe in the state. They believed in getting rid of the state and all of its structures, its monarchy, its history, everything. And so the trouble is, if you oversimplify these things, you come out with a sort of unitary explanation. Oh, you have fascism because of communism. Well, it isn't that simple. On the other hand, those who supported Mussolini...
Oh, darn it.
Frozen again.
Frozen again. And this was just such a one at the end of that sentence. And we hopefully will get it. We're going to do our same little maneuver here very quickly. Let me find Jonathan. Thanking you again for your patience. Let's see. Yep.
Oh, well done.
Brilliant. Yeah. You were mid-sentence.
Yeah, those people who backed Mussolini weren't just, nervous shopkeepers, but there were also intellectuals and others who swept to him. Out of desperation, the alternative was Bolshevism. And if Lenin hadn't been so busy with Poland in 1920, and if they could have found the arms to do it, they would have Bolshevized Italy if they could have got there in time. And but luckily for them, the occupation of the factories failed, and Gramsci and his friends had no experience of these things. And then they, on their ruins, as it were, the ruins they left behind them, with a failed attempt at really destroying capitalism, the road was paved for Mussolini. Germany, it's much more complicated, as you know, it's much more drawn out. But Hitler, if you read there's this marvelous new edition of Mein Kampf, which is fully annotated from the historians in Munich, and you can troll through, the footnotes, the extraordinary. What you come to realize is Hitler just sort of vacuumed up every conceivable idea of his time that formulated fascism. And because it's usually assumed that Hitler didn't read books, so how could he have taken it? Well, he had some friends who read lots of books, but he also went to the library a lot, because we have lists of things he got from the library. He couldn't write grammatically in German, but he could certainly read it. And so in a way, Hitler, so on the model of Mussolini, makes himself into what he becomes. It's a sort of curious, self-conscious process of recreation into this sort of monster figure, whereas Mussolini was just himself all the time. He wasn't innocuous, but he was less dangerous.
Yeah. Thanks for taking a little time with that answer. I think it does also fill in a little bit of the texture of your argument. We have time for maybe two, perhaps three more questions if we go just a little past the hour. I want to turn to a question that picks up on the conversation you've been having, the two of you, about Stalin. And this one comes from George Buston. Steve Kotkin, in his multi-volume biography of Stalin, describes him as a manic worker attempting to keep on top of every detail, writing voluminous notes on most papers that came to his desk, keeping extraordinary hours in his Kremlin office. How does this square with your view that the Comintern suffered from neglect? Was it merely a low priority for Stalin?
Yes, it's, the remnants of the Russian Empire, although they lost a lot of it, was an absolutely huge country. And they were trying to introduce collectivization of agriculture, take all the land from the peasants. Peasants don't normally give it up freely.
Can I just interrupt you, Jonathan? Because I think you again have two tabs open, perhaps, from our last little escapade.
No,
and you don't?
I got one, sorry.
Okay, all right. There was just a little echo. It wasn't severe.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
And this, what seemed like a crazy project to industrialize or re-industrialize, because they lost a lot of industry in World War I. They lost what heavy industry they had, to re-industrialize Russia. You know, he didn't have many hobbies, and there are only so many hours in the day. But he had priorities, and as far as he was concerned, as David has already started with, he saw the Comintern as a useless talking shop, and, you know, where the old ladies go and chat. Stalin never approved of chattering. If he had someone pleasant comment about somebody, he would say they're like an old lady on the way to the market, just talking all the time. It was both misogynistic and you know, he had no time for small talk, basically. So it was a miracle that he got done what he did get done in the description that Kotkin makes. But in these priorities, some things suffered. He took ages to get into the Spanish Civil War. He was down in Sochi, you know, drinking and having a bit of relaxation. He did not want to get involved in someone else's conflict, with a lot of explanation of what the Russians did wrong or badly was the fact that Stalin waited on decisions. He thought, if I leave it long enough, the decision will make itself, which is how politicians often behave. You know, they have two things on the agenda and everything else, you know, takes a back seat.
Good. I'm going to just wrap two questions here into one, because they both are asking about the relationship between Russia and the Nazis. One question is saying, Karl Radek, a Jew, said that the Bolsheviks would be happy to work with the Nazis. They did. Were they naive about the Nazis? Which links with Victoria Weisfeld's question about what factors made Stalin decide to form a pact with Nazi Germany.
Yeah, Radek was the most extraordinary person. He seemed to be, at least for the first decade and a half of the Soviet Union, the only person who understood international relations at all. And if he'd been running the country, they would have done very well, because he wasn't Russian at all, and that helped. It didn't help him in the end because he got shot, but then a lot of Russians got shot. But he was, he had an intimate understanding of Germany and was in a way a native German speaker as well as a native Polish speaker. So you can take a statement by Radek in 1 year, in one situation, and you can't generalize from it. In other words, he had an incredible understanding of tactics. So in 1923, when the French and the Belgians invade the Ruhr and take it over, Radek says we take up German nationalism to fight them. And then again, although it's not well documented, I believe that Radek had a lot to do with Stalin's policy of supporting German nationalism against the Social Democrats in the early 30s. So he was a sort of gnomic-like figure. He pops up everywhere at unexpected moments with bright ideas. And he managed to escape association with Trotsky and attach himself to Stalin. You know, today he'd be working for Putin, you know. It was like Mikoyan. Everybody used to say about someone like Mikoyan that, you know, if you got in a turning door with him, he would be behind you. But when the door turned, he would get out first. And that Mikoyan was the best foreign minister that Soviet Union never had. And in a way, Radek was the best foreign commissar that Russia never had in the pre-war period. but the most talented people got shot by Stalin. He could abide people for a certain period, and then he just had to shed them.
Yeah. Well, I think I wish we could get to all the questions. We can't do that quite, but I thought I would end with a question here that's a little bit speculative question about the archives. The question comes from, I don't see from whom, what role has or will have the opening of the secret apostolic Vatican archives for our understanding of interwar foreign affairs, fascism, and communism? And I know that you try to get access to those, and that didn't work. So this is speculative, but
yes.
Perhaps you want to comment on that. And then, David, if you have a closing question or comment that you want to add, then the floor will be yours before we wrap up.
Yeah, well, the reason I was so frustrated that the Vatican's secret archive said that I could come and work there, and then when I got there, they said I couldn't see anything. I'm not a Catholic myself, so I have no personal feelings about that. Just frustration, was that they had published some of their documents, the ones on Germany and the ones on Catholic relations with the Hitler's regime. They're fantastic. And also volumes on Spain. I wanted the volumes on France, particularly because it was a counterpart to Spain. And then on Portugal and wherever else I could get into. I don't understand. Vatican politics is like international relations in miniature. It's like the old Comintern. I mean, how anything gets decided on this level, it really depends in the end which cardinal is in fact in charge of all this. Because the Pope will make a declaration saying, we're opening up all these papers after World War II, hurrah! And then there's a headline somewhere in the New York Times or in the Times in London, and nothing happens. And that's what it's like being Pope. So what we would find more material that demonstrates that the church was really behind, in support of fascism against communism in a much more explicit way, because both Piuses were incredibly anti-communist. So, and then the post-war is even more interesting, the birth of Christian democracy. There's the story in the Vatican from the mid-40s or the early 40s of the creation of Christian democracy as a wedge to keep communism out. That was a very far-sighted project, far more far-sighted than the Monet Plan, and actually focused specifically on keeping communism out of Italy. And they kept them out of power long enough to see the Soviet bloc collapse. It was an incredible success. So they may be more willing to let those materials out than the failures of the 30s.
It sounds like it might be worth keeping on it and trying.
I think you need
a next project in here. Yeah. David, do you have any other thoughts or comments or questions before we wrap up?
I think I got to most of the questions, and no point in going back to one or two that would just go over again themes that we talked. So I would just like to say that I very much enjoyed the discussion, and congratulations again to you, Jonathan, on the publication of this magnificent and beautifully produced book. Also, congratulations to Princeton University Press. It's wonderful production that they did with this.
Thank you so much, and I think the press will appreciate it.
Yes, can't say enough good things about our friends at the Princeton University Press. It's another great book, and I joined David in congratulating you, Jonathan, on this book, and thank all of you for joining us. I'll just say that we are almost at the end of our spring event series at Labyrinth, but we have one more coming up with the classicist Daniel Padilla Peralta, check that out too. You can find that on this platform or on our website, labyrinthbooks.com.
Thank you so much for setting this up.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. It really has been. So thank you. Good night and good health. Bye-bye, everyone.